Welcome to the Cognito Pod. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something you've asked about, the long history of U.S. tariffs. We're going way back, starting in 1789 and bringing it up to, well, pretty recently, 2019.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey. We've looked through historical records, economic studies, trade reports, basically trying to piece together the why behind these tariffs.
Exactly. Why were they started? How long did they last? And crucially, what were the results? How did businesses react? What was the economic fallout, including the impact on U.S. debt? And did they actually fix trade deficits?
We'll hit specific examples, some key data points to really try and paint a clear picture. It's not always straightforward.
Definitely not. So where do we start? The very beginning, I guess.
Let's kick things off with the Tariff Act of 1789, right at the start.
Okay, 1789, Congress passes it, George Washington signs it, and this wasn't just a quick thing, right? It set the stage for quite a while.
It really did. The basic framework, with various rate adjustments, of course, lasted essentially until the Civil War.
So why did the brand new U.S. government decide to slap taxes on imports right away?
Two main reasons, really. First, they desperately needed money. Federal revenue was critical. Second, they wanted to give a leg up to new American industries, protect them a bit.
Makes sense. And how effective was it, especially on the money front?
Very effective, actually. Before the income tax really kicked in much later, tariffs were the primary source of federal cash. We're talking the vast majority of it.
Wow.
And it did provide some shelter for those early manufacturers. But as you'd expect, it wasn't all smooth sailing.
How so?
Well, taxing imports naturally led to some friction with other countries. Trade tensions started early, and it also created a pretty strong incentive for smuggling, to get around the taxes.
Right. So how did the business community feel? Must have been mixed reactions.
Definitely. Manufacturers, especially the new ones, they were generally fans. It helped them compete.
But importers, consumers.
Less thrilled, yeah. Merchants dealing in imports faced higher costs, and ultimately those costs often got passed down to consumers. So not popular with everyone.
And the overall economy, short-term versus long-term.
Short-term. More federal money, higher prices on imported stuff. Long-term, though, that revenue was pretty important. It helped fund early infrastructure, roads, canals, things that supported growth.
And the debt, you mentioned that.
Yeah, this is interesting. Tariff revenue was key to managing the early national debt. There's a period like between 1828 and 1833 where the debt actually decreased significantly from about $58 million down to $38 million.
And tariffs paid for most government expenses then?
Around 90%, yeah. It shows just how central tariffs were to the whole financial system back there.
A completely different world from today's budget debates. Okay, let's move ahead a few decades. 1828, the Tariff of Abominations.
Yes, that one definitely earned its nickname.
Sounds like it. Who was behind this one and why abominations?
This came under President John Quincy Adams, pushed hard by northern industrialists.
Okay, northern factories. What was their angle?
Protection, mainly. After the War of 1812, British goods, especially textiles, were flooding the market, often cheaper than American-made stuff. Northern factories wanted a shield against that.
But the South wasn't happy.
And not at all. The Southern economy relied heavily on exporting things like cotton. They saw this tariff as just raising their costs for things they needed to import, and they worried, rightly, about other countries hitting their exports with retaliatory tariffs.
So what made it so abominable specifically? The rates.
The rates went way up.
Yeah.
Average duties jumped to between 45 and 50%. That's a huge increase.
Wow, so that hypothetical $10 roll of British fabric
Could easily become $14.15 or $15,
Yeah.
A massive price hike. The aim was clear. Protect northern industry, keep revenue flowing.
How long did this super high tariff stay in place? It sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It was. It lasted effectively until 1833. The backlash, especially from South Carolina, was intense. It led directly to the nullification crisis.
Where South Carolina basically said they wouldn't enforce the federal law.
Exactly. A major constitutional crisis. It was eventually diffused by the Compromise Tariff Act of 1833, which gradually lowered the rates back down. But it really showed the deep regional divides tariffs could expose.
So, outcomes. Did it work apart from sparking a crisis?
Well, it brought in a lot of money, about $23 million a year by 1830, still covering maybe 90% of federal income. But the political cost was enormous, and trade did slow down. British imports fell maybe 10% or so.
What about business sentiment beyond the North?
Very divided. Northern textile mills did well, saw output rise maybe 15% in those few years.
Not the South.
Strongly opposed. Flanders felt squeezed. You see quotes from merchants back then saying things like, this tariff chokes our trade for northern gain.
Right.
A lot of resentment. Shippers probably had mixed results. Less British trade, but domestic trade held up.
And the wider economy, GDP, prices.
Short-term, GDP growth might have dipped slightly, maybe 0.5%, partly due to falling southern exports. Consumer prices definitely rose. Things like tools could be 20 or 30% more expensive.
And long-term.
Long-term, it really deepened that north-south economic and political split. It didn't cause the Civil War, obviously, but it was a significant factor in worsening those tensions. Manufacturing saw modest growth, but overall economic impact wasn't huge long-term, besides the political fallout.
And the debt situation during this abominable period?
Debt was already fairly low, around $58 million in 1828. The tariff revenue helped push it down further to about $38 million by 1833. So again, tariffs were working as a debt reduction tool, funding the government.
That pattern is really clear in the early history. Okay, let's jump forward again. McKinley Tariff, 1890. Different era.
Yes, post-Civil War, industrializing nation. This one was driven by Representative William McKinley under President Benjamin Harrison. Republicans were behind it.
And their goal this time, still protection.
Very much so. Protecting American industries, especially steel and textiles, from European competition. The U.S. was becoming an industrial power, and they wanted to nurture that. Plus, raising revenue after the Civil War's expenses was still a factor.
How high did McKinley take the rates?
Pretty high again. The average rate hit about 48%. Specific examples. Steel tariffs went up significantly, maybe from $20 a ton to nearly $30. Wool duties also jumped quite a bit. It covered thousands of items.
A broad shield. How long did this one last?
Until 1894. It was replaced by the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which generally lowered rates again. Seems to be a pattern, right? High tariffs, then often a reaction leading to lower ones.
Definitely. So outcomes of McKinley, revenue good, any downsides?
Revenue was strong, around $200 million a year, making up about half of federal income then. But yeah, downsides too. Imports dropped maybe 15% initially.
Which usually means
Retaliation, exactly. France hit U.S. pork, for instance. That hurt American pork exports. Domestically, steel output did rise about 10%, but consumer prices went up. That $5 imported shirt might now cost closer to $7.40.
And that usually means
Unhappy voters. There was a backlash against the Republicans in the next elections, partly because of those higher prices.
how did businesses react on the ground? Steel must have liked it.
Oh yeah. Big steel companies like Carnegie Steel boomed. Production practically doubled in those few years. Textile mills got some benefit, but then faced issues with their own exports declining.
Who didn't like it?
Farmers weren't happy, facing retaliation on their exports. Retailers felt squeezed by higher wholesale costs as grumbling customers. There are quotes from store owners complaining about it. Exporters obviously suffered.
What about the overall economic picture?
Short term, GDP actually grew pretty well initially, about 4% from 1890 to 92, but then the panic of 1893 hit, slowing things down, though the tariff wasn't the sole cause of the panic. Prices rose 5 to 10% for consumers on lots of goods.
Jobs.
Seal-added jobs, maybe 10,000. But retail likely lost some due to slower sales, so a shift. Long term, it probably did help strengthen the U.S. industrial base, steel especially. Trade normalized after 1894, but those higher consumer costs lingered for a while.
And the debt during McKinley.
The debt was about $1.1 billion in 1890. The tariff brought in revenue, but government spending was also Civil War pensions, building up the Navy. So the debt stayed pretty stable, around $1.2 billion by 1894. The revenue basically covered the increased spending.
Okay, so tariffs are still important for revenue, but maybe not driving down debt like before. Let's hit the 20th century. Underwood Tariff, 1913. Sounds different.
It was a shift, yes, under President Woodrow Wilson. This was a move towards lower tariffs.
Why the change?
Well, the Democrats generally favored freer trade, but the really big change was the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913, thanks to the 16th Amendment.
Ah, so the government had another major way to raise money.
Exactly. Less reliance on tariffs for revenue. That opened the door politically to lower the rates.
How much did they lower them?
Significantly. The average rate dropped from around 44% down to about 25%. The idea was more trade, lower prices for consumers.
And did that happen? What were the results?
Trade did increase initially, but then World War I happened.
Complicates things.
Massively. It completely scrambled global trade patterns. Tariff revenue went down as expected because of lower rates, but the income tax quickly took over as the main source of federal funds. The war itself also changed what was being traded and with whom.
How did U.S. businesses take this move to lower tariffs?
It was mixed. Importers liked it, more competition, potentially lower costs. But some domestic manufacturers, the ones used to high protection, were naturally worried about facing more foreign competition.
Overall economic impact, short and long term.
Short term, yeah, more trade, probably some downward pressure on consumer prices for imports. Then the war demand boosted trade revenue in certain sectors, like war material.
In long-term significance.
Long-term, Underwood is seen as a key step toward more liberal trade policies for the U.S. It cemented the shift away from tariffs as the main revenue source and kind of paved the way for later agreements like GATT and the WTO.
What about the debt impact? With the income tax and the war?
Well, reliance on tariff revenue dropped, but World War I was incredibly expensive. So the national debt soared because of war spending, completely overshadowing any effects from the tariff changes.
Okay, so after the war, things shifted again. Forty-McCumber Tariff Act, 1922. Back to higher rates.
Yes, a swing back towards protectionism under President Warren Harding.
Why the reversal after Underwood and the war?
Post-war adjustments. European economies were starting to recover and ramp up production. American farmers and industries felt threatened by renewed foreign competition, losing some of those wartime markets. They wanted protection back.
What did Forty-McCumber do?
It raised rates back up, above the Underwood levels. And significantly, it gave the president power to adjust rates by up to 50% without needing Congress each time.
More flexibility for the president. Interesting.
Yeah, meant to allow quicker responses to trade conditions. The goal was definitely to make it harder for European goods, especially to compete in the U.S. market.
Consequence.
Well, it did make it harder for European nations to sell goods here, which in turn made it harder for them to earn the dollars they needed to pay back war debts they owed to the U.S.
An unintended consequence.
Or perhaps partly intended, depending on your view.
Yeah.
It definitely protected some U.S. industries, but also ramped up global trade tensions again.
Business reactions. Farmers liked it this time.
Farmers facing competition, yes, and some manufacturers supported it. But exporters, like cotton growers, didn't. They faced potential retaliation and higher costs. Consumers saw prices go up again. Retailers felt the pressure.
Economic impact.
Short term, yeah, protected some sectors, cut imports, raised consumer prices, increased trade friction. Long term.
Well, it's seen as contributing to the worsening global trade environment that led straight into
Smoot-Hawley.
Exactly. Forty-McCumber kind of set the stage for that disaster.
And the debt impact of Forty-McCumber. Significant revenue. It brought in some revenue, maybe $200 million a year. But by the 1920s, with income tax established, tariffs were a smaller piece of the pie. Debt fluctuated for other reasons. This tariff wasn't a major driver of the debt level itself.
Which brings us, as you said, to the infamous one, Smoot-Hawley, 1930, right as the Great Depression is starting.
Terrible timing, terrible policy, enacted under President Herbert Hoover.
What was the thinking? Why raise tariffs then?
It seems counterintuitive now, but the thinking was defensive. Farm prices were collapsing. Wheat, for example, plummeted. Factories were closing. There was this desperate hope that blocking imports would save American jobs and farms. Both farmers and manufacturers were lobbying hard for it.
And just how high did Smoot-Hawley raise the rates?
Extremely high. It covered over 20,000 items. The average rate went up by about 20%, but many specific items saw duty skyrocket, some to 60%. Things like wool, cars, sugar. Huge increases.
Protecting jobs and farms was the goal. How long did these rates last?
The peak damage was really from 1930 to about 1934. Then, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act started a slow process of lowering them, which continued much more significantly after World War II, with GTT.
And the outcomes. You called it a disaster.
Utter disaster.
Yeah.
Global trade basically collapsed. It fell by 2/3 between 1929 and 1933.
67%. Wow.
Yeah. U.S. exports crashed.
Yeah.
Imports crashed. And retaliation was swift and severe. Canada hit U.S. eggs and cars. Europe followed. It just spiraled downwards.
Did he even raise much revenue?
Revenue peaked briefly, but was still a small part of federal income and nowhere near enough to offset the economic collapse. Unemployment hit 25%. GDP shrank dramatically. It's almost universally agreed now that Smoot-Hawley made the Great Depression significantly deeper and longer.
How did businesses react, the ones it was meant to help?
Farmers were devastated. Their export markets vanished. There are stories of wheat rotting because Europe stopped buying. Steel got maybe a tiny initial bump, but cars, retail, crushed by the collapsing economy. Ford laid off thousands. Retailers saw prices go up, sales plummet. Nobody won, really.
The overall economic impact sounds catastrophic.
It was. Short term, GDP plunged 8.5% just between 1930-31. Prices rose on things like clothing, maybe 15%. Massive job losses, millions in manufacturing alone, long term. It prolonged the depression, damaged global trade networks for years, slowed recovery, just a terrible own goal.
And the U.S. debt during this?
It shot up from around $16 billion in 29 to $22 billion by 33. The government was running huge deficits because the economy collapsed. Tariff revenue was a drop in the bucket. The debt to GDP ratio exploded.
A truly cautionary tale. Okay, let's leap forward quite a bit. Post-war era saw generally lower tariffs under GD, but then we get to 2002, the steel tariffs under George W. Bush. Why tariffs then?
This was different. It used Section 232, an executive power related to national security, though the trigger was economic distress in the U.S. steel industry.
What distress?
Bankruptcies, job losses. The industry was struggling with cheap steel imports, particularly from Asia and Europe. Lots of U.S. steel companies went under between 1998 and 2001, losing tens of thousands of jobs.
So what did the 2002 tariffs do?
They imposed duties of 8 to 30% on imported steel from those countries. Key partners like Canada and Mexico were exempted, though. The clear aim was to help U.S. steel producers and save jobs by raising the price of imports.
How long did these last? Not decades, right?
No, much shorter, about 21 months. Implemented in March 2002, repealed in December 2003.
Why were they repealed so quickly?
Two main reasons. The World Trade Organization ruled they were illegal under international trade rules, and, maybe more importantly, the European Union threatened serious retaliation on politically sensitive U.S. exports like Florida oranges.
Ah, the politics of trade. What were the outcomes during those 21 months?
Steel imports did drop, about 28%. U.S. steel production and prices went up. That part worked as intended. But industries that use steel, car parts makers, construction, appliances, they got hit hard. Their costs went up. Estimates suggest they lost more money and far more jobs than the steel industry gained. Something like 200,000 jobs lost in those downstream industries.
More jobs lost than existed in the whole steel sector.
That was the finding of one prominent study. Yeah, it highlights the trade-offs. Revenue gain was modest, maybe $650 million total.
Business reactions. Predictable?
Pretty much. Steel companies were happy. U.S. steel's production rose. You heard mill managers saying, we're back in business. But auto parts makers, appliance companies, strongly against it. Their CEOs warned about layoffs because of the higher steel costs. Consumers saw small price bumps on things like washing machines.
The broader economic impact.
Short term, maybe a tiny dip in overall GDP, like 0.1%. Slight rise in consumer prices, job gains in steel, much bigger losses downstream. Long term, though, minimal impact once they were repealed. Trade went back to normal pretty quickly. Downstream industries recovered.
And the debt impact of the 2002 tariffs.
Negligible. The national debt was rising significantly then for other reasons, tax cuts, military spending. The $650 million from steel tariffs was tiny in comparison to the overall budget picture and deficits.
Okay, that brings us to the most recent major episode, the Trump tariffs of 2018-2019. Very broad, very controversial. Motivations.
Several stated goals here. Reducing the overall U.S. trade deficit, which was large, pressure from China specifically over its trade practices, especially regarding intellectual property theft, and trying to boost U.S. manufacturing jobs, which had seen long-term decline.
What goods and countries were hit?
It was wide-ranging. Steel and aluminum tariffs hit most countries initially, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. Then, escalating tariffs specifically on Chinese goods, eventually covering hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imports, electronics, machinery, consumer goods.
How long do these last? Are they still around?
Many are still largely in effect, yes. The Biden administration kept most of them, particularly on steel in China, though with some adjustments and ongoing reviews, so their impact continues beyond that initial 2018-19 period.
Outcomes. What did we see happen?
Okay, several things. They generated quite a bit of revenue, maybe $70–80 billion a year at the peak, but still a small fraction of total federal revenue. Imports from China did decrease.
So the bilateral deficit with China went down.
It did. But overall U.S. imports didn't fall much because trade shifted. Imports from places like Vietnam, Mexico, Taiwan increased instead. So the overall trade deficit didn't shrink. In fact, it often grew.
Interesting. What else?
Consumer prices for specific goods went up. Washing machines, tires, furniture. China retaliated, hitting U.S. agriculture hard, especially soybeans. Farmers suffered significant losses, though the government provided substantial aid payments.
Economic growth.
Jobs. Most studies suggest a small negative impact on GDP, maybe a couple tenths of a percent long term. Job impacts were mixed. Gains in protected sectors like steel, but net job losses overall, maybe around 150,000, as downstream industries and exporters felt the pain. Steel production did increase modestly.
Business sentiment. Again, probably divided.
Very much so. Steel and aluminum producers were generally supportive. Nucor added jobs, but farmers were hit hard despite the aid. Retailers like Walmart reported higher costs, squeezing margins or forcing price increases. Supply chains are definitely disrupted.
Overall economic impact, short and long-term view.
Short term, that small GDP dip, modest consumer price increases, job shifts. Long term, studies point to that slight drag on GDP. Trade patterns definitely shifted away from China towards other countries. Inflationary effects seem to have faded over time, but the tariffs themselves remain a cost in the system. No major structural boom for U.S. industry resulted.
And the debt impact, finally. These tariffs brought in tens of billions. Did it help?
Not really, in the grand scheme. The national debt rose dramatically during that period, from $21 trillion to $27 trillion, driven by tax cuts and the massive COVID-related spending. The tariff revenue, while substantial, was dwarfed by deficits exceeding $1 trillion annually. It didn't change the debt trajectory.
Okay, so looking across this whole sweep of history, over 2 centuries of tariffs, what are the big takeaways, the overall patterns?
Well, you see some recurring themes. Short-term tariffs often do raise prices for consumers. They shift jobs, helping protected industries, hurting others like exporters or those using the taxed imports. The overall GDP impact varies, sometimes small, sometimes like Smoot-Hawley, disastrously large.
And longer term.
Narrow, targeted tariffs seem to do less lasting damage than broad, sweeping ones, which can really disrupt trade and slow growth. Gains in protected industries often don't make up for losses elsewhere in the economy, especially when retaliation hits exports.
What about the debt connection? That really changed over time.
Hugely. Pre-1900, tariffs were absolutely vital for revenue and debt management. They funded the government. Post-income tax, especially post-WWII, their role in federal finance became much, much smaller. Recent tariffs generate billions, but it's minor compared to overall spending and deficits. They don't really move the needle on national debt anymore.
And business sentiment, always split.
Generally, yes. Protected industries support them. Exporters and downstream users oppose them. Retailers are often caught in the middle, dealing with costs and customer reactions. That pattern seems pretty consistent across history.
One last big question often tied to tariffs. Trade deficits. Did tariffs historically succeed in reducing overall U.S. trade deficits?
That's a key point. The argument is often made, right? Tax imports, buy less from abroad, deficit shrinks. But the historical evidence, especially in the modern era, doesn't really support that.
Why not?
Several reasons economists point to. Tariffs don't usually address the underlying causes of trade deficits, which are more about national savings and investment rates. Retaliation is a big one. Tariffs cut imports, but retaliation cuts exports, often canceling out any deficit effect or even worsening it.
Like with Smoot-Hawley or the China tariffs hitting soybeans?
Exactly. Also, currency values can adjust, offsetting the tariff's price effect. And as we saw with the recent China tariffs, trade often just diverts, but we buy less from China, but more from Vietnam or Mexico, so the overall deficit doesn't necessarily improve.
So historical examples.
Smoot-Hawley saw trade collapse, but the U.S. deficit didn't vanish because exports fell so drastically. The recent Trump tariffs saw the deficit with China fall, but the overall U.S. trade deficit actually increased significantly during that period. Most mainstream economic research suggests tariffs are an ineffective, often counterproductive, tool for tackling trade deficits. They tend to shrink overall trade rather than rebalance it.
So reflecting on this whole history, tariffs have been used for revenue, for protection, sometimes with specific goals, sometimes with broad ones. The results seem incredibly mixed, often bringing unintended consequences. And their effectiveness, especially for goals like deficit reduction in the modern economy, seems pretty questionable based on the record.
That seems like a fair summary. The motivations change, the context changes, but the complexities and trade-offs remain. Understanding this history is pretty crucial when we hear about new tariff proposals today, thinking about what effects are likely based on past experience.
Definitely food for thought. It's rarely as simple as the rhetoric suggests.
Thanks for listening to the Cognito Pod.